Um, so without further ado, Ethan, let's just jump straight in. We were just chatting a little bit before the conversation went live. It's kind of impossible to discuss a book about internal dialogue and self-talk without acknowledging the fact that, you know, we are living through a moment which has seen us listening to our inner voice more than ever before, sitting with our thoughts in a way we've never had to. And a lot of us have realized over the last 10 months that we don't like a lot of what our inner voice has to say to us. You know, might be the first time we've been conscious of this internal negative self-talk that you characterize as chatter. And we may also have noticed it's become dramatically worse over the last few months of the pandemic as sort of like exhaustion sets in. So if you were writing this book again now, would it change the way that you talk about chatter? You know, can you tell us some important things about how we should begin to grapple with our experience of chatter in relation to the moment that we're living through?
Yeah, I think we're living through, the chatter event of the century, and by century I don't mean the last 20 years. I mean like the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Um, I turned in the final version of what I thought was the final version of this manuscript for the book Chatter about a month before COVID started, and once it hit, I remember having a conversation with my editor, and I said, if you had asked me at the start of this project to give you the formula for like the biggest chatter event you can imagine, what we're living through right now would be exactly it: a once in a century pandemic, economic turmoil, political instability. That's certainly political instability, certainly in the States. I'm pretty sure that applies to the UK. Not sure about all the other countries that are being represented here.
Mm-hmm.
Social discord between different groups. I mean, there's a lot of tension in the world, and a lot of these things are they're uncontrollable, and what happens next is uncertain. And those two ingredients, uncertainty and uncontrollability, those fuel chatter, this negative side to introspection. And so for those of you who are experiencing higher levels of chatter now than you would normally, the first thing I would say is that makes total sense, right? So abnormal times call for abnormal reactions. I think we have data showing that chatter is elevated across the board now. The good news is that there are science-based tools that I think people can use to try to help with that chatter. And in fact, much of the book is talking about what those different tools are. So would I have written the book differently if I started it now? Maybe there'd be a few different stories that I would have told. But in terms of the science wouldn't have changed in terms of the techniques that I review.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie, when I got my copy of the book, I jumped straight to the section in the back that says the tools, because I was like, okay, you know, I mean, I've actually practiced meditation for many years, you know, exercise, sleep, whatever, all these things. And, you know, some of my usual sort of self-calming mechanisms have certainly failed me in this moment. Have you had to dig a bit deeper to like calm your own? I mean, you open the book talking about this experience that you had. You can tell us a little bit about, in your own words, where you sort of really had to like address your own chatter internally. But how have you dealt with the last 10 months? Have you like really had to dig? Have you had to reread the tools basically?
Well, you know, when you work on the book for 4 years, the tools don't need to be reread. They're burned into my
Okay.
visual cortex. But
Yeah.
but one of the ideas that I talk about in the book is that there are no there are no single magic pills, right? There's no one tool that works for every person in every situation to magically get rid of chatter. Instead, we have lots of different tools that exist. And I think the challenge that readers, listeners, and also scientists, the challenge that we now confront is to figure out what are the combinations of tools that work best for you in the particular chatter provoking situations you find yourself in.
Mm-hmm.
And so this applies to me too as a scientist who studies this material. I have had to stumble on my own set of 3 or 4 tools that I use now regularly and that do help. So I'll give you a couple examples. One thing that I do, and I talk about this in Chatter, is something called temporal distancing. Well, you know what? Before I say tools, maybe we should just let me give like a 60-second overview of chatter and introspection because I think it's helpful.
Yeah,
So
100%. It's so hard not to jump straight to it
jump
because I
right
have
in.
the appetite for that, but you're absolutely right. Let's rewind a little bit and talk about, because that was one thing when I read the intros, I was like, where do you draw the line between, of course, we all have our internal voice, our thoughts, you might characterize, what's the distinction between a healthy thought process and the line where it crosses into a negative chatter experience?
Yeah. So the inner voice, the ability to, think in verbally, which isn't the only kind of thought we have. We also can think in terms of images, but verbal reasoning is an incredible tool. And it helps us do a lot of things, this inner voice. It helps us plan and simulate and problem solve and create. Like I can think about an hour earlier, I thought, okay, Phoebe's going to interview me. Here's what she's going to say. Here's how I'm going to respond. I could do a simulation. So the inner voice, really, really useful.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes not so useful is when we experience a problem and then we turn our attention inward to try to make sense of that problem, which is what we often do. Like we encounter events that we stumble on, we try to get closure around those experiences, and we use language to help us do that. When we experience distress and we zoom in on our problems and then find ourselves getting stuck, experiencing a negative cycle of thinking and feeling, we worry, we ruminate, we catastrophize. When we do that, as opposed to coming up with clear solutions to the problems we're facing, that's what chatter is about. It's
Right.
getting stuck in those negative thought loops that lots of science shows can have significant negative effects on how we think and perform, on our relationships, and on our health. So that's the negative side of things. And it's characterized by this almost tunnel vision on the awfulness of the situation, right? So when you're experiencing chatter about COVID, you're zooming in and thinking about how miserable this is. I can't see my friends and loved ones. When am I ever I can't travel. My kids, I'll reveal to the group here, like the level of negotiations I've had to do with my 6 and 10-year-olds to make sure that they don't come in while this event is occurring, like you wouldn't believe, because they like to just sit at my foot and work. So like that makes things hard, right?
Yeah.
And so often what we find is really useful when people are experiencing chatter is finding tools to help broaden their perspective so
Right.
that they can think about the situation they're facing more objectively, right? To take the big picture into account. And so here's one way that I do that with COVID. I do something called temporal distancing. That's psychological jargon. The way I like to describe that to others is just mental time travel. So I'll think about frequently when I find myself getting stuck, ruminating about what I'm going through, I'll think about, well, 18 months from now, these are the different trips I'm taking. And I'll go over those different trips. And or maybe it's not 18 months, maybe it's 12 months. That window of time that I have to travel to where I could realistically imagine traveling changes depending on where we are with our vaccine supply. But what that mental exercise does is something that for me is powerful. It makes it clear that what I'm going through right now, as awful as it is, and it is awful, it's temporary. It will eventually end and life will return to normal. And that gives me hope. And we know, again, from lots of science, that having hope can be a really powerful experience for alleviating chatter. So I'll go forward in time. I'll also go backwards in time to try to put my experience in perspective. So I frequently think about the last great pandemic we experienced in 1918. And as awful as this is right now, that was equally, if not worse, right? We couldn't do these sorts of things in 1918. We couldn't have an international event like this. We couldn't get food delivery like I think many of us can, right? And I think back to that pandemic, and I think, well, that was really terrible. But guess what? We got through it, and we'll get through this one too. So those little shifts, that doesn't make me blissfully happy and it doesn't lead me to deny what I'm feeling right now, but it makes it a lot more tolerable.
Mm.
And it turns down the volume on the chatter. And so that's just one tool that I use. Um, I'll also make use of nature. Nature can be a powerful boon to your inner voice, the positive side of it. I talk to particular people who are skilled at not getting me to just ruminate about everything, but to broaden my perspective. So I do a few different things.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about, obviously there's kind of like this idea in our culture that it's always good to talk. It's really good to vent, to get it out. Obviously there's a big tradition of sort of talk therapy in the West, and it was interesting to read the part of your book where you wrote about how like science shows that actually it's not always that beneficial to talk about what's going on internally. I mean, can you speak a little bit more on that? Like, how do you distinguish between when it's a healthy sort of like sharing cathartic experience and when actually you're just making it worse for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So other people, so I think of the tools that exist for managing chatter. I think of them as falling into three buckets. Things you could do on your own, like
Mhm.
perspective shifts that you can engage in. There are like 10 or so different neat things that one can do. And I just described one with mental time travel. Then there's a bucket about how we can interact with our physical spaces, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But the
Yeah.
third bucket consists of other people. Other people in our lives can be either a force of good or bad when it comes to our chatter. So other people can either amplify the chatter or make it better.
Right.
And the key is to know who to talk to and what kinds of conversations to have. And so one popular belief that doesn't have a whole lot of data and science behind it is one that is still very prevalent, this idea that venting, when you're experiencing chatter, get it out, unload, dump it, vent your emotions to just cathect, right? There's been a lot of research on venting over the past several decades. And consistently, what scientists find is that when you vent about an experience to another person, that makes you feel closer and more connected to the person you're talking about. So, Phoebe, if I call you up and I just got to tell you about this, and I just unload and you respond, really? Tell me again exactly what they said. I can't believe it. How did you feel? So when you keep doing that, that makes me feel closer to you because I know you care enough about me to listen. But if you think about what happens when you're just asking me more and more questions about my feelings,
Mm.
it's kind of like you're throwing logs on the flame. You're kindling the fire because you're getting me to relive those emotions over and over again. What you ideally want to have happen in a conversation designed to reduce chatter is two things. First, you want to talk about your emotions to some degree. So you want to be able to express yourself. Talking is good, but once you know enough about what the person is feeling and experiencing, you want to try to help broaden their perspective. Other people are often in an ideal position to do that because the problems that they're often confronted with, they're not happening to the other person. So I often ask, if we were all together right now, I'd ask the audience, like, have you ever been in a situation where a friend or a loved one comes to you with a problem? They're experiencing chatter, they don't know what to do, and it's easy for you to offer them advice. And most people raise their hand and say, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a basic feature of like the human condition. If it's not happening to us, it's a whole lot easier for us to advise someone else. And so, but that advice giving piece of social exchanges, it sometimes gets lost when we
Mm.
talk to other people about our problems. They think that the way to be a good friend is to just hear us out, not to also help shift our perspective. And that sometimes leads our chatter to be maintained because we're not changing the way we think about the problem in a way that gives us closure.
Right. Yeah. So you'd advise maybe just being highly conscious of like talking maybe just to your problem solving friends rather than people who just want to kind of revel in
Yeah,
the in the drama with you.
I'm extremely deliberate about who I turn to talk about my chatter. I
Yeah.
don't want to give I don't want to give listeners or people here the impression that I'm chatter all the time. By the way, we're talking so much about my own. When chatter does hit for me, which I think it does for most of us, I think really carefully about who I should chat about it with. There are
Mm.
some people in my life who I love dearly, and I know they love me, and I do not talk to them because I know it's just going to be a vent session, a co-rumination fest
Just
that's going to
sparkle.
leave me just feeling bad. And so I turn to others,
For
uh,
sure.
and they help.
I really liked reading about your dad in the introduction to the book. You sound like a really interesting character, like a lot of kind of different. And you say that he kind of, when you were a child, he was always asking, telling you like, look inside yourself for answers.
Mhm.
So I guess that's a great like early learning on sort of how to not necessarily always seek other people's insight. But you did say that you don't use that approach with your own children. I guess one of, as well as managing our own anxiety and internal dialogue, I'm personally not a parent, but many of my friends do have children, and their children are anxious right now. How do you speak to your children about sort of like managing their own chatter in this moment?
Well, one thing that one idea that I think psychologists and cognitive scientists and people who study the mind and brain take for granted that not everyone else always recognizes is the fact that our thoughts don't have to control how we feel. The idea that we have agency as humans, and this is what part of what makes us human beings so unique, is that we have the capacity to change the way how we think, which can change the way we feel. And with my daughters who are 6 and 10, what I've noticed is that idea is not something that is intuitive for them. So when they're having a fit, like they're experiencing major chatter. The youngest is experiencing the major chatter because like the piece of chocolate that she got for dessert is a gram lighter than the piece of chocolate that her sister got. I mean, these are major events for 6-year-olds.
It's grounds for a meltdown.
Big time, right?
Yeah.
So explaining to her, you don't have to feel this way. That I mean, and just teaching her about the mind and how it works. I found that to be useful with my kids. And in fact, we actually have a large project where we've developed a curriculum to teach high school kids about how the mind works when it comes to emotion management and self-control.
Mm.
And the whole premise behind this project is, well, let me back up. So what we've done in this project is we've taken what we know about the science of emotion management, a lot of the work that I talk about in Chatter, but
Mm.
other material too. We've taken that and we've translated it, working with teachers, into lesson plans, a curriculum, so that we can teach students about the mind and how it works in this way. And the idea is that simply knowing how the mind works can be empowering, right? And so we're doing studies now to see if that is indeed true. So once you go through the curriculum, are you able to use some of the knowledge you gain to profitably improve yourself later on in life?
And
Uh,
yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy that that children aren't taught sort of like even the basics of controlling your inner self-talk, because as you document throughout the book in myriad ways, it can literally affect the entire outcome of your life. The way where your ability to harness or not harness your internal dialogue can shape the entire trajectory of your life. And like one thing that I really kind of gave me chills actually reading was like the power of the mind body connection, with the impact that like negative talk can have on your actual physical body, to the extent that if you get stuck into very negative self-talk spirals for excessive amounts of time, it's like your body reacts as if you're under like immediate physical threat, like in terms of the stress response, which is obviously very dangerous for you in the long term when it builds up in a chronic way. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
yeah, well, there's so much to unpack there that is near and dear to my heart. So let me address the physical bit, and then we'll back up, and I want to say something else about the teaching bit and the importance of this
Yeah,
material. So we're running, our time is going so quick.
I
This
know
is
it
like
would.
we have way too much to talk about.
Mhm.
So
So they have to buy the book.
So I want to be really clear with people. Experiencing stress itself is not a bad thing. A stress reaction, negativity, in small doses is really good. Like the ability to experience a pang of anxiety is functional according to lots of science, right? Like if I'm thinking about, oh, I have a really high stakes project I need to complete, having a ping of anxiety a week before, that mobilizes me to do the work necessary to perform well there. So negative emotions can be useful. When negative emotions and when stress becomes harmful is when we experience those emotions and that biological response, and then it remains chronically activated over time.
Mm.
That's when we experience, that's what we're not designed for. We're not designed to experience stress all the time. That exerts a significant wear and tear on the body that predicts a host of physical diseases, things like cardiovascular disease, certain forms of cancer, and so forth. And chatter is one of the culprits that help perpetuate those chronic stress reactions, because we are so, the mind is capable of creating our own stress response and then perpetuating it. Because I can be rejected by an editor or a colleague or my children, and rather than just experience that event and move on, I'm capable of reliving and re-experience that rejection over and over and over and over again. And that's how it gets under the skin. And even, as I talk a little bit about in the book, can even influence the way our genes are expressed. And so it really is, the mind and the body are super tightly connected. Um, so well,
There's so much I want to
I
ask you.
forgot what else I wanted to say.
No, I know. I was like, and I'm like trying to jump with my next question. I mean, do you mind if I ask you another question?
No, go for it.
There is one that I mean, you know, being a millennial, this is one that maybe is like particularly relevant to my age group and people below me, but kind of the role of social media. I think particularly I was saying, like, I feel like there's a lot of pressure to present as being super peaceful and, you know, having very much harnessed your inner dialogue and being, you know, what I call toxic positivity. And I just, you do write in the book about sort of social media and like how it's not necessarily always a negative thing, but we were saying, you know, you were saying you think it's really important to stress that like it's very normal to experience negative self-talk, and I think that that's something that people can benefit from hearing, especially right now, because I think a lot of people are suffering in silos and comparing themselves to other people online who seem to be doing great in the pandemic, you know?
Yeah. So, you know, I've been researching, we've been doing research on social media and well-being for about 10 years in my lab. And social media is really interesting when it comes to the inner voice, because in many ways, I think it provides us with a giant megaphone for broadcasting what's streaming through our heads. And if you actually think about Facebook, the prompt, at one point, I think this is still true, it said, "What's on your mind?" So it's beckoning us to share what's happening in our head. Mm-hmm. People here have probably heard a lot of press which suggests social media is toxic, stay away. Other arguments say it's really good. My opinion on this is it's not de facto good or bad. It depends on how you navigate it. And it's much like the physical world, in the sense that social media provides us with a new environment to play around in. And how we play around in that environment will impact how we feel. And so if you think about the physical world, if I go into the wrong neighborhoods and talk to the wrong people, I'm going to get in trouble. Mm-hmm. If, on the other hand, I seek out other kinds of experiences in the physical world, they can be the source of enormous joy and meaning. Now, what's different about physical and social media is that from the time we're born, we're socialized. We learn. Our parents, our friends, our caretakers, they're teaching us how to navigate this world to our betterment, right? I learned, don't go here, go here. This is how you talk to someone. This is not how you talk to someone. We learned those rules. Those were rules that have been curated over time, passed down from one generation and through our culture. They're transmitted to us. Social media has only been around for 15 years. Mm-hmm. And we haven't quite had the time to be socialized into how to use it, right? The science is only beginning to now be able to tell us, if you interact this way, this can be bad for you, and this other way can be useful. And so in the book, I try to articulate a little bit about what we've learned. So, try to stay away from passively just taking in the curated news feeds of other people, because, if you just see how awesome their worlds are, and full well how mediocre your life is right now, that's not going to make you feel so great. But on the other hand, you might want to use social media to seek out and provide support for others that could be really useful in that regard. So I think it's a fascinating space.
Yeah, and very much in development. I wanted to ask just round out my section, one super quick question, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Just to touch on, because I know we want to discuss a little bit, like the impact of physical environment. Obviously, we're all living in very contained quarters right now. People have varying degrees of access to nature. I'm right in the middle of London, so there's it's pretty intense here. So do you have any just final words of advice on how people can sort of like use their physical environment to the best effect right now for their internal chatter?
Yeah, so I'll give you the shorthand note on this. So
Okay,
enhance your exposure to green spaces. There's a lot of great data showing that green space exposure, and what I mean by that is trees and greenery and plants, that can help rejuvenate the attention that is often sapped by chatter. Like, if we can only focus so much at any given moment in time, and if all of that focus is on our chatter, that doesn't leave much over to like do other things like our work or have engaging conversations. So enhance your exposure to green spaces can help with that. Try to create order in your environment. When we're experiencing chatter, we often feel like we're not in control of our mind. It's disordered, it's chaotic. And what we've learned is we can compensate for that experience by turning to our environment and tidying up and placing things in order. I'm not the most organized guy. Usually I'm kind of free with things. My office doesn't usually look like this, but when I was writing the book, I'd find myself doing weird things when I was stressed out. Like I'd go to the kitchen and clean all the pots and pans and put them together very neatly. And that helped, right? And so it's another thing you can do. And the final bit on the environment is seek out awe-inspiring experiences. So awe, the emotion, right, is something we feel when we're in the presence of something vast that we can't explain. So, the number of stars in the sky, like billions of stars, how I have trouble computing what that means. Or, I'm still awestruck by planes. I think like at one point we were futzing around with sticks, really struggling hard to create fires. And, now we figured out how to blast people off in tin cans and land them safely. Like, how did we do that? That elicits awe. And what we know is that when people experience awe, when they're in the presence of something vast and indescribable, that makes them and their own concerns feel a whole lot smaller by comparison. Right. And feeling smaller may not be something we always aspire to, but shrinking our chatter and having our chatter seem smaller, that can be really useful. So those are three environmental tips that I elaborate on in the book.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to jump over to some of the questions that have come in just because we've had so many and I wish we could answer all of them because they're actually great questions. I'm actually going to do one that was on my list, which I didn't get around to. Sort of someone says, interesting about mental time travel. I would ask how this fits in with mindfulness. It seems like it runs contrary to it. I have to say, I was quite surprised to not, I was expecting there to be a massive section on mindfulness and meditation, to be totally frank, because that's obviously a very popular way of approaching anxiety and depression and other internal issues right now. So can I ask why that isn't touched on so much in your book?
Yeah, sure. So, mindfulness and meditation are great. And if you read Chatter, you'll see that I've actually have personal experience with this. I got a mantra when I was 5 years old. I wanted a bicycle for my birthday, but I got a mantra instead from my dad, who was an interesting character, as you alluded to.
That's very cool.
So, the premise of many mindfulness practices is for us to recalibrate ourselves and focus on the moment. And I think that can be great. But to a certain extent, it's working against the machine. We can't always be in the moment. In fact, one of the features that makes human beings unique is we've evolved the capacity to not be in the moment. So we spend between 1/3 and 1/2 of our waking hours not focused on the moment. We lost in thought about the past and the future. And this is something that I think is not de facto bad. I would not want to give up my ability to travel in time, right? The ability to travel back in time, I can learn from my mistakes, to think about the future. That helps me plan. It helps me fantasize. I can savor experiences. All of those mental time traveling gymnastics, like that makes life worth living to me to a certain degree. And so really what the book deals with is how can you travel forward and back in time without getting stuck in rumination and anxiety and chatter, right? And I try to make the point that the only solution is not refocusing on the present, that there are other ways of managing those chatter experiences that don't involve meditation.
Right. Okay. That's very interesting. Someone else says, do you have any tips on how to start your day with positive or at least neutral chatter? My chatter often kicks off with a negative inflection for the day before I'm even consciously engaged with it.
Yeah, so one thing you might want to do is we haven't talked about distant self-talk. So try to coach yourself through a problem, talking to yourself like you would a friend, and actually use your own name to do it. As wacky as that sounds, do that silently. But as I mentioned before, one of the things we know is it's much easier to advise other people on their problems than it is to take our own advice. And what we've learned is that language can provide us with a route, a tool for rerouting our internal dialogues and making them more coach-like. And it involves using your own name to talk to yourself. So, all right, come on, Ethan, what are we going to do today? How are we going to approach the situation? That switches you into a more coach-like as opposed to critic mode that can often be useful. And it's pretty easy to do.
Yeah, I find that if I write out my whatever's in my head in the morning, kind of in a third person type of way, I really make my exposing my my own inner struggles right now. But I find that if I can do that and see it in black and white, it gives me a distance from it.
Yeah.
And it really, and also just getting it down on paper, the act of like having to write out the problem already in the writing, you kind of start to formulate the solution, or at least like the counter thought. Do you journal? What are your like go-to chatter techniques? I know you talked about the temporal distancing, but
I use distant self-talk. I use temporal distancing. I lean on my chatter advisors, so to speak. I've got a whole network of them that I tap regularly, and also I provide services back to them. I'm a big fan of enhancing my exposure to green spaces. I also talk in the book about rituals, and I have a couple of personal rituals that I engage in too. And rituals can be really useful for chatter if not taken to an extreme. So journaling is something that I write about in the book. There's a lot of data showing that journaling can be really useful for helping people manage chatter. And it does have a distancing component, because when you're writing about yourself, you're becoming the character in a story. And, a character is someone that's separate from you. And so I don't personally do journaling a whole lot, but but that's part of this idea that different tools work for different people in different situations. And so,
so kind of, I'm going to kind of merge two questions here, but I think maybe people are slightly struggling with you understand the concept of the distant self-talk and whatnot. Someone says saying something different as a start. How do you help shift the mind to actually believing the new internal dialogue? Like if you're having very persistent negative internal dialogue and you're trying techniques, like what in your experience is the key to sort of making the shift in the mental rumination change?
yeah, this is a fantastic question. All the questions have been great before. I think what this taps into is the idea that easier said than done, right? Like, so most people, I think, who are experiencing chatter, they know they want to feel better, right? So they're trying to do stuff to feel better. They know that it's better to have a more positive orientation, a less critical one, but they have trouble actualizing that change, bringing it about. And that's where the concept of distancing we think is useful. And there are lots of different ways you can do it. What distancing helps us do is step back and gain a little bit of objectivity to the situation. And once we step back and have a clearer view of the situation, then it becomes possible to follow through with our goals. And our goals in many cases are to not experience chatter and to feel better and to work through an experience. So let me make this concrete. So if I'm kind of anxious about um, you know what an editor is going to say about a scientific paper, and oh my God, what if they say it's awful, they rejected years of work, and I get stuck in that thought loop. Like, I don't want to be there, but I'm stuck. When I step back and I broaden my perspective, I realize, hold on a second, Ethan, you've written hundreds of papers before. Many of them have been rejected many times before they've been published. It's part of the game. They'll probably say something negative, and then you'll respond. So that zooming out a bit gives us access to different kinds of information that are convincing, that help us reason through the problem more effectively.
Mm-hmm. For sure. This is an interesting question. How does your conscious chatter work with your unconscious, I guess your subconscious thinking?
Oh boy. It's funny. I sometimes, so just as this, I promise you, I'm not dodging the question. I will get back to it, but these are fun because, for the past 15 years or so, I'm the one on dissertation committees, and I'm peppering students, with hard questions before they defend their dissertation and get their PhD. And I feel now the role reversal. It's like, it's karma. Now I'm getting all the tough questions. The subconscious and conscious and how those interact remain a mystery. I wish I could tell you I knew exactly how it all worked. We don't yet know from a scientific point of view. We do know, and I spent a little bit of time talking about this, that our waking mind communicates with our sleeping and dreaming mind. So it's not uncommon to see our chatter manifest in our dreams, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But how exactly that works, we don't know. Now, we do know that if you can help people with their chatter, that makes it easier to sleep better and reduces some of the negative subconscious consequences that we often see. But in terms of the dynamics and the architecture behind all that, there's a lot more science that needs to be done.
I'm sure. Yeah, the mind seems to be a complete mystery still.
Well, that's good. I mean, there's still like room to explore.
100%. So I just wanted to ask you one more question I've been sent through, which I think is interesting. Many people have started to view proper therapy, as in psychotherapy, I assume, as a way to cope with the current climate. Someone asked if you've ever had therapy yourself. You don't have to answer that if you don't want to. But I wonder, obviously, I would imagine, I don't want to make blanket assumptions, but that the way that we approach problems and think and try and deal with internal chatter must be shaped to some extent by experiences we had in childhood, in the same way that like our patterns when you go to therapy, it's all about unpacking your childhood. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, is there a point where you would say that internal, on a good day, I can do these things that you're talking about, but I can't lie, I have days where I can't pull myself out of it. And do you think that there's a line where maybe therapy is going to need to be necessary, or any?
Absolutely. So, I wrote this book targeted towards helping people deal with problems of living, which are characteristic of all of us, right? And the kind of chatter that just accompanies stumbling through the world. Now, can that chatter morph into more extreme forms of clinical forms of anxiety and depression? Absolutely. We see evidence of that. And in those cases, if you find yourself struggling in ways that are paralyzing and that are really interfering with your ability to live well on a consistent basis, then I advocate going for therapy. And I think you absolutely should. The kinds of interventions that are often administered in therapy, they share some overlap with some of the techniques I talk about, but they're more intensive. And sometimes that more intensive form of intervention can be really useful. Someone asked if I've been in therapy. I haven't personally, but I totally endorse it. I refer people all the time, and I think it serves a great good. With respect to childhood, there are different views on what the best ways of intervening are therapeutically. Some forms of therapy go back into childhood more than others. Many empirically based therapies that are popular nowadays don't actually, by default, spend a ton of time in the past. They deal more with the problems you're experiencing right now. So, our past experiences, we certainly imprint to some degree. Whenever I say imprint, I feel like that dark vampire movie with the Harry Potter guy. What was that called? Do you remember the reference? Twilight, the Twilight series.
Twilight.
I don't know if that was popular over in the UK, but our parents shape our inner voice, but there's a lot of other experiences that also impact it too as we navigate our lives. And so there's a lot of malleability to it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I really want to keep asking you questions. Maybe I'll ask you one really quick last one and then we'll round it out.
Okay.
For anyone who's sort of like chatter has got to a point of where it feels like a sort of paralysis where you can't move forward and can't decipher, what's the first step that you take, in terms of breaking down that, like if the internal chatter has got to a point of just like noise and you're just feeling stuck on how to act?
Well, I think there's the question is it getting to a point where it's interfering with your ability to live well consistently over time for for 2 weeks, right? I think if it gets to that point, then you want to seek out some therapeutic help. If it's just really loud for, whatever, a day or two, I mean, I think you want to try implementing the different tools that I talk about. I mean, for me, I could tell you that talking to someone out, talking to the right people is often really, really helpful when the amplitude of the chatter gets really, really high. I like, talking to other people and getting some mental space by getting out of the house and clearing my head in the woods. Like that for me is particularly effective. And if you have people to turn to, there's no harm in trying that.
Yeah.
With all of these tools, I think if they don't work, don't use them, right? Give them a shot, right? Like it's like an exercise at the gym. Some exercises are going to be you're going to enjoy them. It's going to make you stronger. Others you might not like as much. And, for me, journaling, nothing against journaling, but it's not my thing. Like,
Right.
but it's a lot of great data behind it.
Yeah, as you say, it's about figuring out the kind of set of tools that really works for you. And excuse, this is a galley copy, so the actual book is more beautiful than this. But what's great is that you really do at the back of the book just have this very concise breakdown of all the tools. And I'm sure if you spent a few days like running through all of them, you'd feel better by the end of it, or at least you'd have a good idea of where you were stuck and where in your life you really needed to make some changes. So thank you so much, Ethan, for taking the time to go through the book with us. It is a brilliant book. It's very digestible, which is, I think, all of us like very overwhelmed right now. So much information, so much uncertainty. It's nice to read a book that's like very clear and super comprehensive. So thank you, Ethan. For people who are asking about missing some of this or will it be shared, it's been live streamed to YouTube, I believe, so it'll be available there straight afterwards. And I think Second Home will also share an audio recording of this with everyone who attended within the next couple of days. So I could talk to you for hours, Ethan, but sadly we're going to wrap this up now. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you to everyone who watched. Thank you to Second Home for hosting us. And I hope everyone is able to calm the inner noise a little bit after today's talk.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. It was really, really a great deal of fun, and hopefully next time we get to see each other in person.
One day. All right. Thanks a lot. Take care,
Take
everyone.
care. Bye.
Bye.